We're going to talk about strategic planning, and I have a model of strategic planning that I really like, and I'm going to share with you the model. But before I talk about the model, I want you to turn in your coloring books again. Excuse me for coloring these coloring books. I just think that's a cute name, actually. Okay. This here, okay? This is I call this the attitude continuum. And so that's what it looks like. And what I was trying to communicate with this, and you'll see the relevance because it is definitely relevant to strategic planning. But in every relationship that we're a part of, so let's think of the relationships that we're a part of. Some of us are married, so we have a marital relationship. Most of you are members of a church, so you have a church relationship. Many of you are working with an organization, perhaps other than the organization that you're here representing. I know some of you have secular jobs, and so you're working on a job place. And so you have relationships. You know, that's another relationship that you have in life. You may be in a service club. You may be in a small group in your church. You may be, in a variety of different relationships, and we're all in a variety of different relationships. And in every one of those relationships that I just mentioned, we are somewhere on a continuum, somewhere between being cynical about that organization, what it is that it does, or euphoric. Now, those are about the only two words that I could think that were extreme. Cynical is the guy that's kind of, and the gal, that basically just is critical of everything that you do, basically has had, probably a whole bunch of bad experiences, and so he or she is more than willing to share them with anybody. And that's unfortunate, of course, because the average dissatisfied customer shares their dissatisfaction with about 15 people, when the average satisfied customer shares it with about 5. And so if you have enough unhappy people that are disgruntled and upset about you, then the realities are there is a tipping point where that really does become a significant impact in your ability to be able to effectively do ministry. So there are some cynical people out there in the world, and then there are some people that are just like euphoric. Whenever they hear about you, they smile, they want to jump up and down and say, this is the greatest organization in the world. They're just kind of bubbly about it. They can't talk enough about it. And so those are two extremes. And I think most of us would agree that, there are very few people that perhaps are, cynical, probably more cynical than euphoric, but it represents a rather small percentage, perhaps, of the total number of people that basically represent our supporting network. Now, right here in the middle is a person that's just coming into an organization. Now, they may be coming into the organization as a potential. They're coming into your church because they think that this is a great church, and perhaps I can find in this church what it is that I'm looking for that's going to meet my needs, whatever those needs might be. It's going into a new job, and this is the first time that the first day on the job, and so you're just kind of coming in. You don't know too much about the people who work there. You don't know, whether they're good people or bad people. But you have a real optimistic outlook in terms of the business and what it does and represents, and so you come in with certain levels of expectations. But you're coming into that relationship. You join a club. You join a small group that may be a part of your church. I mean, there's all kinds of these relationships that are out there. You choose to marry this person. And so you're entering into a relationship, and all of us enter into relationships with expectations that are based upon the needs that we perceive that we want this particular relationship to help us address. Okay? So we all come in with expectations, and almost always our expectations are unrealistic. Usually people coming in have expectations, and they're not always realistic. In fact, often they're not realistic at all. And so consequently, we set ourselves up many times for failure only because we don't share with people expectations. I mean, in other words, if you don't share with people what they are to expect from this relationship, then they're going to project out what it is that they expect to receive from this relationship. And so, the first key is when people come to your organization, probably the best thing you could do is just sit down with them. What are your expectations? What are you looking for as you come into here? Because we'd love to have those expectations met. Let me tell you how it typically works in our organization. You're going to come here, and the first thing that's going to happen to you, you're going to get overwhelmed because there's just an awful lot that we do that you might not understand. And so it's really important that you understand that we're not sometimes, because of how much we have to do and the limited resources that we have, that we do the best that we can, but sometimes it can get a little hairy around here, and you just need to understand that. Well, if you just say that to someone when it happens, they're not surprised. Or if you're coming into a church and thinking that somebody's going to recognize you for all the gifts that you have, spiritual gifts that you have, and are going to immediately put you into leadership because you obviously are very, very good at what it is that you do and you should be placed into leadership, at least that's your perspective, then the realities are you're probably going to be disappointed, because it's probably not going to happen that way. And so the pastor or someone in the church membership committee or someone comes to you and says, let me tell you what happens here, because we want you to be comfortable. We want you to sit down for the first month or 6 weeks that you're here and just absorb what it is that God's doing and allow us the opportunity to get to know you so that we can work together, perhaps to find places and areas of our church that you might be able to participate. Well, if I'm expecting that I'm going to be picked next week for a leadership position that's going to, be, significant, then I'm probably going to be disappointed. So the best way to deal with unrealized expectations is to create expectations. But we oftentimes don't do that. So we're almost starting at a negative step from the beginning, because now we've got people that at least initially will be prone to move over here, and not because always just because of you, but because everything in most people's minds is kind of wants to go here, but they're very, very slow to move over here because many of them have had bad experiences. And this is just one of another bad experience that they don't want to have. And so people generally are cautious to get too enthusiastic too soon in relationships, that they hope will be meaningful. So I'm going to call this south, okay? We're going to have south and we're going to have north. So I'll refer about people going south and people going north so you know what I'm talking about. Now, there are 3 steps that are outlined in there in the sheet that you have in front of you that lead to cynicism. And they're very, very logical, and most of you would look at them and say, yeah, that makes sense. They come in initially with expectations, hoping that things are going to be different than they've ever experienced before. And when they don't happen the way they anticipate they're going to happen, then they become discouraged. Well, I just thought they had their act a little bit better together than this. I was hoping that I would have a leadership position, and I haven't even been acknowledged for the fact that I have gifts that basically could be used in the context of this ministry. I had hoped that this group that I'm a part of, this small group in my church, was going to be my church where I could, engage with them, they could engage with us, and we could, happily join together in living life together. And it hasn't happened that way. And so they get discouraged. Now, the next step is frustration. And frustration is a person who's discouraged who knows why, or who at least thinks he knows why, that if you were to do something differently, they wouldn't be discouraged. And so they get frustrated. A frustrated person is kind of like tense. Really, you can almost see it in them. And they talk about their why they're discouraged. And they said, well, if they would only do this, then I would never be discouraged. And they're just almost shaking, when they're saying it, because they're extremely frustrated because they think they know the answer. Now, they may have some good insight, but they may not have the answer. Now, the next step, if you don't deal with this, then eventually they become apathetic. They kind of develop the attitude, well, if they don't care, why should I? Like, nobody seems to care around here, so I'm just going to join the crowd. And so you just kind of go out there and you're just not engaged at all. And then, if you let apathy exist for a long time and not deal with it, then people become cynical. And usually during this period of time, a lot of people just leave and go start over again someplace else. And in churches, that's almost always true unless you're Lutheran. See, Lutherans never leave, you know. I mean, and I'm being facetious, and I always pick on Lutherans, but sometimes I'll pick on other people. I mean, it could be Baptists, it could be anybody, and I'm not picking on anyone because I have an adversarial relationship with them, so don't misunderstand me. But a lot of my Lutheran friends, I mean, we've been Lutheran, you know, for all of our lives. My grandfather was a Lutheran, my great-grandfather was a Lutheran, my great-great-grandfather was a Lutheran. In fact, you know, we're kind of related to Martha or Martin and whatever her name was. And I really do know her name, but I just can't remember it right now. But you know, we kind of related to them, and so, you know, this has been our church ever since we were baptized in this church. We were born in this church. We're going to live in this church. We're going to die in this church. And so what happens is you'll notice that they're kind of gravitating constantly towards the back row. And usually the back row is filled with the cynics, you know, who basically are going to evaluate and assess everything that you're going to do and remind you that it's never going to work, so why would you bother to try? And so, and you know that. So, now the unfortunate thing is that these people you have to live with. In other words, they're not going to go away. It's not like you can say, well, I'm going to erase my database because I don't really like these people on my database because they're all cynical and I'm just going to... Well, I mean, if you could erase it, you'd reproduce the same thing eventually. But the realities are the only way you can move people from here this way is through success. In other words, you need to set goals, you need to set objectives, and you need to let people know where you're going. That's what a strategic plan is. You need to let them know where you're going, and then when it happens, you need to celebrate it. And you need to remind people that this is something that we said we were going to do, and it's been done, and we're going to celebrate what it is that's happened so that we can continue to move on. And so the only way you're going to be able to do this is to basically move them forward by strategically reminding people periodically that these things are happening in accordance to the mission and in light of the mission that we've committed ourselves and the vision to which we're striving for, and just kind of remind people, because people don't see it, and if they don't see it, they're not going to respond to it, and if they don't respond to it, you're basically putting yourself at risk. Now, there are 3 steps that lead to euphoria. And one is encouragement. That's the first one. People get encouraged, they get excited. You walk in, you say, this is a different kind of place. People have different kinds of attitudes. They seem to be very sensitive to one another. They're working very precisely and in an orderly way to move people down a continuum so that they can fulfill their potential. And so they get encouraged. And then they get hopeful that maybe this is, you know, where it is that I can find myself. This is, maybe I found the place. And again, they're very tentative because most of us have been hurt over here. We have bad experiences to share with people, and I'm sure if I asked you all, you could all share a bad experience that wants to prevent you from moving over here. Then you get enthusiastic. Well, I'm just really enthusiastic about this, and then you get euphoric. You're kind of bubbling all over, and you can't stop talking about an organization. And there are people that are that way. I mean, I've met people that way, and some of you are that way as it relates to the organization of which you're a part. Now, I think sin and hurt combined, you know, kind of automatically move us in this direction. And that's just natural, and that's not something we're going to get over. I think there's a propensity for us to move south just because we don't want to get hurt. We're safe there, and we're not going to be disappointed, so if we don't have any expectations, we're never disappointed. And so that, you know, that's a problem. But the realities are, you know, this is really relevant to the discussion on strategic planning. And it's really relevant on this discussion of strategic planning because where anyone is, and listen carefully to the statement, where anyone is on the attitude continuum, wherever they are, wherever the dot is, where anyone is on the attitude continuum is predicated on their perception of your ability to do what it is you say you're going to do. Okay? Now let me repeat that. And don't forget, this is like a really, really important statement. Where anyone is on the attitude continuum, where you may find yourself here, you may find yourself here in some relationships, you may find yourself here, but wherever you are on the attitude continuum, where you ended up was basically based upon your perception of the ability of the organization or the person to do what it is that you were expecting them to do. So if you went into marriage thinking that, everything was going to be happily ever after, life was going to be just perfect always, you'd never have an argument. No, we'll never have an argument. We just love each other so much. He comes in on the white horse, you jump on, you kind of go off into the sunset, and everything's perfect. Well, you're going to be disappointed because it's not going to happen that way. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, it's absolutely essential to grow, and to become deeper and deeper in relationship. That's going to happen as a result of trials, and to try to communicate. I know in Christian circles we do that, and I think there's songs that talk about it. I probably could think of some of the words of them, I've just never been happy again, and all the wonderful things that we basically talk about our relationship with God. And I think happiness, if you're looking at it being always euphoric, then you're going to be set up for some disappointments because it's not that way, and we all know that. And if we could just tell people, and even our children, this trials thing that's between knowledge and understanding. This is a process you need to understand, sweetheart, as you're talking to your daughter. And this is what it is that's going to go through, and it's going to be hurtful, and it's going to be hard. But let me show you, let me give you the tools that you need in order to be able to deal with it. Then all of a sudden, it's not unexpected, it's not a surprise, and we know that it's a part of life. So keep that in the back of your mind, that this really does impact the planning process. Because what do we do when we create strategic plans? We're telling people what we're going to do. And if we don't produce, then we put ourselves in harm's way. In other words, I have been in organizations that I periodically get invited to facilitate strategic planning initiatives. And I've talked to people within the organization, and some of them are really reluctant about going into the relationship of, let's do a strategic plan, because they'll say, well, we did that 2 years ago. So we have versions. Let's see, version 2001. That was a pretty funny one, actually. 2003, a little bit more realistic, but it never happened. 2007, well, that was a mess. And they're looking at strategic plans, almost... we're going to do it again, and we're expecting the same results because it never changes anything. And so is there any reason why people would be cynical? They all start into the process. Most of the groups that I work with, when I start talking about strategic plan, they all start at cynical because we've done it before, and it never really works out for us. I'm going to give you, and like I say, this is a little bit of a different attack on this topic, which I think is extremely important. And a lot of it is based upon how things have changed in the economy, how things have changed in this new world of philanthropy that I talked about, this 21st century philanthropy. And part of it is the new emphasis, which has always been an emphasis, but it's an even greater emphasis now on outcomes versus outputs. Typically we have looked at strategic planning as being, improving our outputs so that they're more attractive to donors who might want to invest in us. And so what I mean by outputs are the things that we're doing, like Vesna may say that, we met with 1,300 girls last year that were facing a crisis pregnancy. That 1,300, 800 made a choice for life. And so, those are statistics that are meaningful. We had, this, that, and the other thing happened, and those are all outputs. In other words, all we're saying is this is what we did last year. We had at IFES and Slovenia, these are the things that happened last year, and we began to talk about it that way. All right, those are outputs. But something, nobody in the charitable world right now is all that concerned about outputs. They want to know about them, and obviously if they're inadequate, they're going to, obviously raise their eyebrows and so forth. But what they're really, really concerned about is outcomes. In other words, what does a person look like 10 years from after they left you, in terms of how they are responding, essentially, to the mission to which you've committed to as an organization. Because the purpose of I mean, saving a baby is one thing. But 10 years later, being a mom who's happily married and living in a relationship, with a man and growing their family in responsible ways, that's an outcome that basically should be the ultimate goal of what it is you've committed yourself. And I know that's the case. So people are concerned about those outcomes more than they are the outputs, because if you're not producing that, which is a reasonable expectation, if you extrapolate from your mission statement what it is that you really are committed to doing, basically it ought to be reflected, in some very, very observable, tangible ways in the future. And so outcomes are like really, really important. And so I've become completely aware of this, and it's changed a lot of the focus that I'm taking now on strategic planning, and when we do it with organizations. And so I'm going to walk you through the process. And as I'm walking you through the process, I want to remind you of something. That the difference between good and great in an organization costs nothing.
No money.
Yeah, no money. It costs something, but no money. It's free. And we have got to get that mentality clear in our minds, because, as nonprofit organizations or organizations that receive money from other people, we kind of feel like we could kind of go out and do as much as we could get people to support financially. And so we just, we do things, and basically we make decisions about what we do based upon whether or not we have a constituency that would respond to it. And so we're kind of, building, an organization around, something that we know that is going to be appealing to our constituents. And so, we continue to do that, and we continue to do that. And essentially, it's resulted in some very, very disappointing outcomes. I think, and I was involved in this, so I'm speaking to myself, but, back after the walls fell down and we could come back into areas of the world that basically had been closed to us as Christians to come in and boldly proclaim the message of the gospel, there was a strong evangelistic effort that many of you are clearly aware of and perhaps participated in your countries. In America, it was called the Co-Mission. It was just a group of, organizations, wonderful organizations. The Campus Crusade for Christ was a part of that. Focus on the Family was a part of that. The Association of Christian Schools International was a part of that. Walk Through the Bible. Those were all, those were the primary founders of the original movement. And I was involved in it from the very, very beginning, before it was even called the Co-Mission. I went to the very first meeting where it was, we got together in Whittier, California, and we began to talk about this vision when it was just emerging as an opportunity. And we went out, in droves and hordes, and we went out and we basically, had the Jesus film and a lot of other great things that emerged out of that whole initiative, and it had some pretty significant results. I continue to talk to people because of my involvement with the Jesus film and raising a lot of resources to make that possible for people to have it in their own countries. And I continue to hear from people that say, that's where I came to know Christ. That's what made the difference in my life, and so forth. So I know it made a difference. But the other thing that we brought with us was our culture. And in our culture, we have mega churches in America. I go to a mega church that 5,000 people show up on Sunday morning. That's really a big church. And we showed pictures of our churches. And we let people think, you could do this in your country. And realizing that this, $50 million building, we could build it in Kyiv. And we can build it in every other place. And some of those churches were built, and they were built on American dollars from people who basically are very, very fickle. You know what fickle is? That's love them today and not even know that they existed tomorrow. That's kind of an American thing. And I'm not proud of it. But basically, we were passionate about it until the next crisis came along. And we gave enough money for some of those buildings to get started, and then we left them, and they were left empty. And we tried to transpose our culture on your culture, which was wrong. And so consequently, in many respects, we did more damage to the cause of Christ in the body of Christ, and not more damage, but certainly we did damage, that basically is still being felt. I mean, there are people in countries where I have served, that are representing ministries, and they get not one single dollar from the community because the community's attitude towards that organization is, why would you bother with us? Just go over to America. They'll give you the money. And so consequently, we have no partners because we never had the need for partners because they were all over there. And now they're all gone, and we find ourselves holding the bag. And I'm concerned about that. I mean, I've spent a lot of time confessing to the Lord, the sin that I think was committed there. And I don't think the sin was committed that we came and we shared the gospel of Christ. But I think in trying to convince people that basically the way we need to be doing life is the way we do it and not the way that it's being done here. And so for that, I apologize for everybody. But do you understand what I'm saying? And maybe you're saying, well, that never happened in our country. But my guess is that you probably are all, some of you were nodding all the time that I was talking about that because you can give me real live examples of how it was happening, where you live. Now, so we're talking a little bit about outcomes. And now I'm going to give you the model. There's 8 steps in the model. It's kind of really easy. And actually, it's a simple thing. It's not like horribly profound, and you could probably guess why, because I'm not horribly profound. But it works, and it works exceptionally well. So here's the 8 steps, and then we'll go back to how it plays out practically within an organization like yours. The first step in this planning process is what I call profile. And profile is a picture of the ideal. A picture of the ideal. Now, it occurs at a variety of different levels. Planning is kind of a layered thing. You're layering, you're first of all talking about the big picture, and then you kind of keep going down to plan the components that are going to make the big picture become reality. And so what I'm doing now, which I never did before to the extent that we're doing it now in our practice, is when we talk about profiles, the picture of the ideal, what we're asking people to do is to imagine the year is 2024. It's 10 years from now. I just kind of rolled in with my walker and the oxygen. I hope that's not the case. But here we are, we're back here in 2024. And the exercise that we're doing now is basically back in 2014 when we were all together, here in Wisła. Jerry asked us to make a picture of the ideal of what we want a client of ours to look like 10 years from now. In other words, he forced us into thinking not about what we're looking for tomorrow, but what it is that we ultimately want to see realized, in the lives of the people that we serve. What should they look like 10 years from now? Because they should look like something different if we've poured our energies and our money and our resources into plowing into their lives. What would they look like? And when I talk about what would they look like, what would they know? How would they be living? How would they be relating to the church? How would they be relating, to their people in their community? How would they be relating to their employer and so forth? I mean, they should be different, don't you think? If we've been successful in fulfilling the vision and the mission that we've committed ourselves to, what would they look like? We just did this exercise in a Christian school in California. And in fact, I was going to do strategic planning the ways that I've always done it, and they kind of said, we don't want to do it the way you always did it. Because what we really want to talk about, because I had given them a little lecture on outcomes and outputs prior to the introduction of the whole process, they said, we just want to talk about outcomes. Because that's where we're failing. Do you realize that, and I've told you a little bit about this, and so and I've talked so much at this conference. I mean, this is like by the time it's all over, it's like almost 30 hours just of lectures, and then there's everything else. So I honestly don't remember what I've said here. So if I repeat myself, you're going to be very patient with me. But in studies that have been done, in analyzing various aspects of Christian ministry, what's been discovered, because it's being done now on a regular basis, is that the results oftentimes of Christian organizations that are doing something and secular organizations that are doing the same thing, that the impact is not that different. In fact, it's almost minusculely low, like under 2%. In other words, if you have a 2% success rate in accomplishing what it is that you're doing, and you're an investor determining whether or not you're going to invest in this organization, what are you going to do? I don't think so. Why would I invest thousands of dollars to help you to have mediocre results? That doesn't make any sense. And so, and it's going to continue to happen only because there's going to be less and less and less money available. And so now, people, who have money and who are willing to give it, and there still will be an awful lot of people that will do that. So I'm not suggesting that they're going to go away, but they're going to be much more discretionary. And the reason they're going to be discretionary is because I want this dollar to be worth $10 in impact, in the outcomes that you're doing. And if it's happening, believe me, I'm going to happen because you will be assured of success developmentally if you can consistently produce consistent outcomes. And I was telling someone the other day, and if I said this to you, you again, forgive me, but there are 4 universities in America that have above average outcomes. In fact, about 98% of their graduates look exactly like they want them to look like. Isn't that amazing? 4 universities, and 3 primary ones, that 98% of their graduates look like they intend for them to look after they go through the process. And those universities are the United States Air Force Academy, the United States Military Academy, and the United States Naval Academy. They all look the same. And what's really interesting is Sue and I lived in Colorado Springs, which happens to be the home of the United States Air Force Academy. And they have 4,000 students, and there's 1,000 in each class, and they have and one of their practices is they have sponsors. Every cadet who comes to the Air Force Academy has a sponsor who's a member of the community. And you have to kind of apply for that because they just don't pick anyone, but they allowed Sue and I to do that. And so we had 9. We lived in Colorado Springs for 12 years. We had 9 cadets that we supported. And I want you to know, it was the most interesting experience I've ever had in my life. First of all, there are 1,000 slots and about 30,000 applications for people who want to come in. So, basically they're picking who they want, which is really pretty interesting. And what they want, are people who have certain skills, and they're looking for certain things, and I understand that, and that's one of the reasons why they're so successful. But what's really interesting is that these guys, when they'd show up, because they'd always show up the day before they were supposed to go and, log in or whatever, and their parents, we'd invite their parents to come with them, so they'd all stay in our house. And these guys were really, and there were some girls that were a part of that, they really weren't very attractive. I don't mean that they weren't good looking. I'm saying they just were kind of obnoxious. They knew they were smart. They knew they're kind of the cream of the crop. They were arrogant. They were just really not pleasant to be with. Honestly, it was really not something that we really enjoyed. We tried to be, really loving to them, and we obviously were, I'm sure. But the realities are they were just a bunch of arrogant, nasty kids. They weren't nasty. Okay. So, but it's interesting. About 8 weeks later, they were some of the most humble, contrite, polite. That's just in 8 weeks. And 4 years later, they're some of the most incredible young men and young women I have ever known. How could you take a 22-year-old, put him in a multi-million-dollar jet and say, go for it, guy? They're going to train them, obviously, but to have absolute confidence, that everything is going to be okay. one of our friends, it's a family friend, I talked him into going to the Air Force Academy, which he really didn't want to do, and he did it. And he's about 28 years old right now, and there was a period of time when he was like 26 where he was in control. He was the man in charge of coordinating 28 satellites, 25 GPS satellites, 25,000 miles above the Earth. That was his job. And he was like the main man, 25 years old. And I says, well, you think you'll ever leave the Air Force? And he says, well, all of my high school pals, they're working at Pizza Hut. He says, I got this exciting job, and I can do just about anything that I want to do, and he says, no, I think I'll just stay where I'm at because, people aspire to go to the Air Force. 30,000 people do, and 30,000 probably with the other academies and so forth. They aspire to be there. Now, why would anybody? Because it is the toughest education that you'll ever go through. There people yell at you. You don't really have much choice about what it is you're going to do because they tell you what you're going to do, and they tell you how to do it and so forth and so on. Why would people do that? Because I think people aspire, for something better than themselves, and they're willing to pay the price. And so I think, oftentimes we keep, in an effort to try to get people, to join our movement, whatever that movement might be, we try to lower the bar low enough so that they can get over it because we just really want them to come in. This is like really important. And so we'll just lower, is this enough to get you in? Do we have to do this to get you in? Do we have to do this to get you in? And we kind of lower the bar. Maybe what we need to do is we need to raise the bar and say, if you want to look like this, what our goal for you, and this is a guy that we work with, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but there's a guy that we work with that works with troubled young kids, men, boys, and basically his place is the last stop between penitentiary and life. It's somewhat kind of a normal life. And so the judge will say, okay, you've got two choices here. You can go 30 years at the penitentiary, or you can go to Youth Reach. It's your choice. But that's it. There are no options. And, they come to Youth Reach. And these guys are just really tough guys. And they've been guilty of some horrible crimes. And they end up showing it that this guy's... And it's the most extraordinary ministry that I know of, honestly. The transformation that occurs, I could take you to Youth Reach and I would show you some of these people that have been involved by this incredible ministry, and you would say, these are some of the sharpest guys I've ever seen in my life. Honestly, really just incredible kids, and you kind of, what in the world happened here? But one time, one guy was getting ready to leave, and Kurt Williams, who's the director of this, looked at the guy and he says, I'm sorry that you're going to make this choice because it meant going to jail, but he says, I can't stay here. He says, because let me tell you what I aspired, what I wanted to see you look like, because I had every dream of you being, married and children and productive and all that. And he says, that you just shattered my dream. And the kid eventually stayed and, graduated. But I think, when we talk to people, people that are in universities that they're longing to find life and they don't know what life is. They see it in different ways. But if you could create a vision of this is what our organization. We'd love for you to come to know Christ. But let me tell you what life in Christ looks like, and demonstrate it in some ways. And I think you might find people more intrigued than not. So, okay, we've got to move quickly. All right, number 2. So we create a profile, the picture of the ideal. Number 2 is we assess. An assessment means that we take our ideal, okay, and we lay it alongside reality. Okay, this is reality as best we know it. This is what it is that we really long to do, and we're going to give ourselves a grade. Okay, so we're just going to give a little bit of a subjective exercise here, but we're going to give ourselves a grade from A through D. A is that, I think we're doing a great job. I think everything we're doing is really leading to this. Okay, that would be an A. B is I think we're on our way, but we're not there yet, but we're making some good progress. C would be we're kind of there, but there's a lot missing. And D is, what? I mean, we don't even, there's nothing that even looks like this, okay? So the next step is assessment. The third step is quantification. And in quantification, what we're saying is, okay, you gave yourself a C. Why did you give yourself a C? And you say, that's easy, because these 3 things don't exist, or these 6 things don't exist. And so you make a list of all the reasons why you're a C and not a B, or a B and not an A. And then the next step is prioritization. And in prioritization, we're saying, okay, of these 6 things that are missing, which are the most critical? And so you say, well, this would be certainly number 1, this would be number 2, and this would be number 3, and this would be number 4, and this would be number 5, and this would be number 6. And so now you have a prioritized list. And let me just remind you, when we talk about strategic planning, I've already said this, that the defining characteristic of a strategic plan is that it's quantifiable. In other words, you need to have a plan that basically tells you that when you get something done, you cross it off and you go on to the next thing. And if you can't quantify it, if you can't measure it, you don't have a plan. What you have is a good idea. And there are a lot of organizations that have great ideas, but they don't have plans. And so the beauty of this particular model is it yields the kind of quantification that you need in order to be able to measure success towards your goal of where it is that you want to go. Now, number 5, and you see we don't even really get down to the planning process until number 5. And that is, now we create a plan. Now, in the process of planning, generally you're planning, several things. What we did in California just a few weeks ago is we started out creating the profile. And then we measured it. We said we gave ourselves a C-. We quantified it. We had like 17 things that basically didn't exist. We prioritized them in terms of their importance to us. And then we began to put together a plan. And out of that plan emerged other initiatives that we were going to do within the organization that weren't being done now, that basically would facilitate the likelihood of these things becoming reality. And so we went through the process again and how we're going to do that. So it's an ongoing process that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, the next step is organization. And that's, getting, teams together, people that are going to become a part of helping you to achieve these objectives. And usually those teams are going to be a lot of volunteers that are under the direction of someone who knows, where it is we want to go and what it is that we want to get accomplished. And so we're going to organize. We're going to organize ourselves to get it done. And then after we get all the organization in place, then we're going to pull the trigger. We're going to implement. And then it's kind of circuitous in the terms that we're going to evaluate. We're going to constantly evaluate how the progress that we're making towards the plan. Now, as we talked about, we're going to come back to this because I want to, but you remember what we did yesterday in terms of the pyramid. Here you've got the mission. Here you've got the vision. And now you have the strategic plan. So basically, your planning initiatives, typically, basically driven by the cost of implementing them. In other words, we may go through this process and we say to ourselves that in order for us to accomplish, the outcomes that we want, it's going to take us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and it's going to cost us, basically we're anticipating that the cost to the organization might be, let's say, $1 million, and it might be $100 million. But actually, these numbers are going down these days because people are realizing that we might have been able at one time to raise $100 billion, but now we can't. And so people are thinking differently in relationship to a lot of things, and I think that's really, really healthy. So we say we're going to get these 3 things done. There's the quantification part. And so what we do is we try to blend in all the areas where we did planning, take all the initiatives, put them into packages that basically we know we can fund and we know we can succeed. Because if you can't succeed, then all of a sudden the attitude continuum takes place, doesn't it? Now we're moving over into another area because they didn't get it. Again, my perspective is that you told us we were going to do this and it's not happening. And so now they move towards cynicism. And they're like the people that said, that laugh hysterically when they talk about the plan of 2008, because this one was really a weird one and nothing ever happened. And so, while it didn't happen, from a organizational standpoint, what did happen was the loss of confidence of the people that you need to take you where you want to go. See, there are 2 disasters of failure. And so you really, as much as you can prevent failure from happening, and it's you can't obviously totally do it, but it would be irresponsible to say we're going to do all this and it's going to cost us $1 million this year, and we never raise more than $50,000 in any given year. You're almost setting yourself up for disaster. Now, this is what we're going to deal with tomorrow, because it's this series of steps that basically is going to make the difference. And that is, this is the development plan. This is what you are essentially, being tasked to do as leaders of organizations with responsibilities in the area of development, is to create a plan to make sure that all the resources that are needed over here are available when you need them. In other words, the dollars, the time, the people, all these people have, this has got to happen. And if this didn't happen, this won't happen, which means that, your plan won't be complete, it won't become reality, and consequently now you're dealing with a whole new set of problems which are basically reflected in the attitude continuum. Okay? Now, think about this. I mean, just as a planning model, and I'll give you an example of, Sue and I, have a big anniversary coming up, and so we're deciding, what do we want to do for our anniversary? So the first thing we do is we just kind of sit down. We sat down in the back deck of our house the other day, and we're saying, if what would be the perfect celebration? What would be really, really neat that we'd really both enjoy? That would be a neat way to be able to celebrate all these wonderful years that God has given us together. And so we came up with like 5 options. 5 things that we could do. And but we started. First of all, we just started with profile. This is what it is, and all of these options kind of had segments of it that were appealing. Some didn't have them all, and so forth. So we assessed all the options, put them in an order. We quantified them in terms of which one we liked the most. We decided on one, and now we're in the process of planning. And we're organizing now. I guess we're down to this part because Sue's getting things together. And we're going to fly in August to Copenhagen and get on a ship and go up the west coast of Norway. That's kind of like been on my bucket list and her bucket list for a lot of years. And I think, well, this would be a good vacation. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to go up and see some of you guys in Norway. But after that. But anyway, that's the way it works. Now, there is this, guys in the room. I made a huge mistake one time, and I just want to give you kind of a little heads up on it. Don't do this, okay? So this is like, big mistake, don't do it. Sue and I are driving down the road. This is like 10 years ago or so, or 15 years ago. And we're driving down the road, and we're kind of talking, and it was a long trip, like one of these long trips. It's just like really boring, because it was just flat roads going, nowhere but through fields of corn and soybeans. And so And we had not talked for maybe 100 miles or 50 miles. We were just kind of going on. And I said, hey, Sue, I got this great idea. She says, oh, really, what? And I said, let's profile the perfect husband. You really don't want to go there, okay? Just, here, take a little bit of heads up for you guys. Don't go there. This is really not the place you want to go. And she says, well, that would be fun. And I'm thinking, oh, gosh. And part of my reason in saying that, quite frankly, was arrogantly. I thought I was like, number one anyway, and I was just going to, and she was just going to say, oh, yeah, Jerry, this is great, and I'm going to really feel proud and arrogant and so forth. And so the first 7 things out of her voice, were just like A plus, The perfect husband doesn't try to solve all my problems. Oh, what do you mean by that? And she says, that's the problem, Jerry. You want to solve everybody's problems. And you don't have to give an answer to everything. And then she reminded me that she's reasonably intelligent, and I don't need your opinion. I just really like to share with you. And there's something about women that I've never understood. Maybe you guys can help me. When a man says the other day, he is referring to something that happened the other day, like last week or maybe a few days ago. When a woman says the other day, it could be 15 years ago. And they never forget. So we're having this conversation, and I'm really now I'm moping a little bit. I'm feeling really bad about myself. I think I'm a really horrible husband and so forth. And so I'm just, I'm quiet. I'm not saying too much. And she's kind of going on because I asked her to. And so she's kind of going on and clarifying things for me. And she said the other day, you came home from a business trip. Well, that happens like every week, all right? So the other day I came home, and she said, you asked me how my week was. And I said, it was horrible. And then I asked you, or you asked me why it was horrible, and I told you that I went to a church meeting and somebody said something offensive to her, and it was a friend of ours. And while she was talking, and I will admit that this was probably the stupidest thing I have ever done in my life, but while she was talking, I was dialing a number. And she says, what are you doing? I says, don't. And the guy gets on the phone. I mean, it's lucky I'm still alive. I mean, this was not Jerry's smartest day. It was his longest day. And so I'm saying, hey, Larry, hey, Jerry here. Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, Sue was talking about that. Yeah. Yeah, well, I knew that, Larry. Yeah, well, yeah, golf? Yeah, what time? 3? Okay, see you then. Well, it just really wasn't good after that. That wasn't something I should have done, and it didn't work out real well for me. So, guys, just don't go there. And, later she said a little bit later, let's profile the perfect wife. And I says, you're perfect. You're perfect, honey. We don't need to go any further. Nothing. Was that the biggest mistake? Well, it got real funny, but about 10 years later, I mean, it actually wasn't probably that long. It was about a few years later. I came home. How's your day? Week? Horrible. Really? Tell me about it. Well, this happened. I said, oh gosh, that's terrible. What'd you do? Cried. Well, yeah, I guess I probably would have cried too. And we talked about it for a half an hour. And I said, a couple of things that I've learned in life, because since I travel a lot, when I say I'm going to go into my office for a minute, and sometimes it's like 8 hours, that's not really a good thing to do. You really don't want to do that. She's waiting for we're going to go do something, and you're still working. So I said, I've got about 15 minutes of work to do. I'm getting good. I'm getting better. I have listened. I'm going to go into my office. I'm going to work for 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, I'm going to be done. Let's go do something today. She says, okay. So I go into my office. I'm working 13 minutes. I'm looking at my watch. She stands in the doorway, big tears rolling down her eyes. I said, what's wrong, honey? She says, that was just the best conversation we've ever had. I said, I didn't say anything. That's why it was the... So anyway, but it's a great planning model. It is a wonderful planning model. But what happened in California, which I thought was really, really very neat, and honestly, it was I thought, when I left, it was one of the best exercises that we had done, is that they looked at where they wanted to go. They were assessing what they were doing now from a curricular standpoint and all the other things that they were doing in their school, and they realized that none of those things, they had the power of creating change, but they weren't utilizing that power. It wasn't that they needed to change anything, they just needed to make sure that the things that they were doing were really pointing in the right direction and enabling, and so they're asking, coaches and music teachers and teachers, to talk about not only this is where it is we want to go, but now they're talking to a first grade teacher or a third grade teacher saying, okay, how are you going to contribute to that so that we have the likelihood that this is going to happen in the future? And they're doing it all the way down the line. And virtually what happened, which is the point that I want to make that I hope is encouraging to you, that virtually what happened is they created a plan, and the cost of implementing that plan was like, and this is an organization that probably has a $6 or $7 million budget. It probably was not going to cost more than $150,000, which kind of validates, I think, my point is that the difference between good and great doesn't cost money. And we think if we had better facilities, it's like the divorce or the person the couple that's right on the edge of divorce, and they just can't get along. They're just everything's going wrong in their relationship, and so finally they agree to go and talk to a pastor, and they go to the pastor and they say, well, pastor, our marriage is just falling apart, things aren't working, and the pastor says, well, do you have any idea why? And he says, oh yeah, what we need is a larger house. And you're scratching your head saying, what? Let's kind of go back and kind of rework that again. Because the point is, a larger house isn't going to make you better any more than a big facility is going to make you better. Any more than, the one thing that we're missing in order to be able to have a great ministry is we don't have a venue, appropriate venue, or you can just go on and on and on and on and on. But that's not your problem. Honestly, it's not the problem. You can get by on an awful little and have a great ministry. And I can take you to a gazillion of them that look just like that. But somehow we've developed a mentality that, and I think we can thank Kevin Costner for this in the Field of Dreams. If you'll build it, they will come. Well, Kevin Costner isn't God, and if you build it, doesn't mean they're going to come. And so the realities are, if you produce, and if you consistently produce, they will be pounding on your door. They'll be pounding on your door because this is a place that I can get what it is that I need and I want and I long for myself. So planning is just like an important, we use it all the time. Every day I'm doing something, having to do with, but I'm sitting around, in terms of going to a meeting with a couple of people that want to talk to me. And I know what the agenda is. I just say, well, I'll sit in the parking lot and just pray and say, Lord, what do I want to walk away with this looking like? If this was a successful meeting and they walked away with something, what would they walk away with? And you know what happens? Well, first of all, I make a list of the things that I want to happen. So that kind of directs the conversation, doesn't it? This is what I'm going to be talking about. And you know what else it directs? The bridges. The bridges. Because I just don't want to end the meeting. I just want to keep the conversation going. And so I'm sitting down for 5 minutes in the parking lot, before I go into the restaurant, doing two things. What do I want the result to look like? What do I want them to leave with? And what are the bridges going to be? And so it's a productive conversation rather than just a, hey, how you doing? Things going all right? That kind of a thing. And that's what most of our meetings are, and they're not productive because they don't take us anywhere, except growing a relationship, and I'm not suggesting that that's bad at all.